coming back for the second half of the story here this evening. We talked this morning about the story of Sarah, and we're going to talk about the story of Hagar. I found it kind of necessary to do the Sarah story first, but if you're doing a timeline, the Hagar story really comes first. Ishmael comes before Isaac, quite a bit before Isaac, 10 or 12 years before Isaac. But I felt like we needed to do the Sarah part first to get that established before we got into the Hagar part. We'll be looking tonight. You'll see some things and hear some things referenced that we already talked about this morning. But we will be in almost entirely in Genesis until the very end here this evening as well. So if you've got your Bible, I want you to go to there. Now, I want us to think about what we talked about this morning when we talked about Hagar. Lonely, abused. In many ways, you could describe her as a single mother, especially after Isaac would be born, and a slave. All of those words could be used to describe Hagar. She was Sarah's slave, the bondwoman, mistress, however you want to describe that. She was essentially a slave, mother of Abraham's first son, because Sarah could not conceive. And she experienced torment and abuse. However, God was faithful to her and blessed her, and she trusted and experienced God's goodness, maybe that's the word we would say, firsthand. So tonight I want us to think about what can we learn from Hagar? What can we take from Hagar this evening? Well, to start with, we need to think about who she was, who Hagar was. And like I said this morning, we have a handful of pictures, but almost entirely pictures from a much, much later age. So these are interpretations from others, to say the least. But the first time that we see Hagar mentioned is in Genesis chapter 16. I want you to turn there right now before we go any further. I just want to look at the first two verses, but this is her first appearance in the Bible, her first appearance in the story, as it were. Starting in chapter 16 of Genesis, verses 1 and 2. Now, Sarai, remember we said Sarah, and we use those interchangeably tonight, even though they may be different in what we read. Now, Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abraham, "See now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Please go in to my maid, and perhaps I shall obtain children by her." And Abram heeded the voice of Sarai. We read from this morning, but just to sort of reestablish where we were, that Sarah and Abraham had been promised this by God. They had been promised that their descendants, as it were, would be who that Israel would come from. But as we talked about this morning, it wasn't happening at all. It had been a long time. And as we said this morning, we sometimes get a little antsy. We sometimes get a little jumpy. We sometimes sort of take matters into our own hands. That's what Sarah does right here. But I want you to think about you tonight in the position of Hagar. What choice did Hagar have in what was presented to her by Sarah? What options does she have? You know, most of the time, we in our lives have all sorts of options. We'll be presented with something, but we have other options along the way. But none of us have experienced any type of slavery at all that she was in. And so when her mistress, when the person in charge of her, Sarah, says to go, actually she sends Abraham to her, but could Hagar have said no to Abraham? She couldn't have. But by the rules, by the law, whatever, she almost was a requirement, you would say, she had to. She had no choice in the matter. And so she becomes pregnant with Abraham's first child. As we said then, that doesn't really fix anything. Sarah's plan was, well, she'll have this child, and this child will belong to Abraham, and it'll sort of belong to Sarah as a result. But what ends up happening? Well, there's conflict between the two, right? And it makes sense because, again, if we were to put yourself in this situation, there would be conflict in our relationships today if this were to happen, right? And so there's a conflict here. Hagar is mad at Sarah, and I can understand why. But then Abraham sort of is mad about this. Then Sarah is mad at Abraham, and she's mad at Hagar. Everybody's mad at each other. You ever known a situation where somebody sort of acted, or maybe acted a little too soon, didn't weigh all the consequences, and then everybody ended up mad as a result? That's not something that happens today, right? Nah, I think that's probably something that always happens. Almost all conflicts are usually based on something like that. Somebody's done something wrong and they got mad. Listen, I'm telling you this as a school teacher who has dealt with many a boyfriend-girlfriend conflicts over the years, all right? When they come in, you think, boy, one good decision would have fixed all of this. But one good decision would have fixed the whole Sarah, Abraham, Hagar situation as well. Sarah retaliates by treating Hagar poorly. Now, what I want you to think now is not play the role of Hagar. I want you to think about something we didn't talk about this morning. What do you think God thought about all of this? I want you to just put yourself, we're not God, but think about, you told him, you said, well, I'll do this. And then all this is happening. Do you think God perhaps looked at this and thought, I didn't ask for any of this, right? You know, when we think about it in that form, God sees this whole thing. And unlike Sarah, God had compassion on Hagar. Eventually, we see that Hagar will flee. She will just be, in a sense, ran off. She didn't like the situation she was in. Sarah didn't like her. And so she runs away. And while she's in the desert by a spring of water, an angel of the Lord appears and talks to her. Genesis chapter 16, I want us to look at verse 9 and 12. She told the angel that she was running away from her mistress. Now, I want you to think about running away from the person who owns you. If you're captured, what's likely going to happen to you? You're going to be taken back to the person that owns you. Probably not going to be killed, if only because if you're ownership or property, that would be a sunk cost or a lost bit of money. And so you'll notice that when Hagar leaves, she doesn't just go around the corner, down the street, to use a term that we would maybe use today, but she sort of runs off, runs away. She's in the wilderness, as it were. She's gone away from everybody. But this angel appears to her. Genesis chapter 16, verses 9 through 12. We read, "Return to your mistress and submit yourself under her hand. Then the angel of the Lord said to her, I will multiply your descendants exceedingly, so that they shall not be counted for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, Behold, you are with child, and you shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction. He shall be a wild man. His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him. And he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren." Those 4 verses have a little bit of good and a little bit of bad in them, right? If you look at what they say right there, return and submit yourself to the mistress. Well, if you're Hagar in this situation, that's probably the last thing you wanted to hear. But the angel of the Lord, who is protected so far, has taken care of her so far, they send her to do that. It says, now, don't worry, you're going to have this child. Remember, at this time, she's not even had Ishmael at the time. But they said, you're going to have this child. So that's good news, right? She's probably excited about that. And it says that you're going to have this child, and his name's going to be Ishmael, and that's good. But then he goes a little further, and it describes what Ishmael would be like. And he's going to be a wild man, as it were. And it says, you know, that there's going to be conflict right there. Well, that's bad. I don't want my child to be in conflict. So kind of a iffy, you know, there's some good and some bad happening here within this situation. Now, again, I would imagine that if you're Hagar, the last thing you wanted to do was go back to Sarah. But what does she do? Genesis chapter 16 and verse 13, it said, Then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, You are the God who sees. For she said, Have I also here seen him who sees me? I think at this point, Hagar is realizing that she's sort of part of a much bigger plan than anybody else would have thought. You know, sometimes we find ourselves sort of pinpointed into this small thing, and it's kind of a woe is me sort of situation. Why is this happening to me? But we sometimes don't take into account that there's a much bigger world besides just us. Have you ever seen those pictures that they take from outer space of the earth? You ever seen those from the moon or from the spaceships or whatever it might be? Do you realize there are 8 billion people on that ball? But it's a blue ball, and you can't see any of those 8 million people. You can't see anything from outer space except for land and ocean. Now, there's people that say you can see the Great Wall of China. You can't see any of that from outer space. But you know that you're on there somewhere. But does that make you feel a little bit smaller than we sometimes puff ourselves up to be? Think about that for a second. Think about how small we are. I was reading a book, a John Grisham book, just a novel. But they have jury duty in this, and they call in these people. And he says, the guy in there, he says, I've lived in this county for my whole life. And he said, I don't know anybody when they show up for jury duty. Think about that. If you get called for jury duty tomorrow and you have to go to Lincoln County, how many of those people are you going to know? We feel like I know everybody. We are very small, right? But sometimes we think about things that are happening like, why is this affecting me this way? We're part of a much bigger thing. I think Hagar realizes this at about that time. We can only assume that there's some faith growing there within her. Now, a few chapters later, Genesis chapter 21, Isaac was born to Abraham and Sarah. And we read there, and we read about that this morning, that Sarah sees Ishmael mocking. I didn't really mention this morning, but the translation here, the word that's used can mean mocking. It can also mean scoffing, or it can also mean playing. Well, there's a big difference between those things. But I want you to think about how many times have we ever seen parents overreact to something? You ever seen that? There's a whole world full of videos floating around out there of parents overreacting to certain things. So I don't know if it's mocking, that's pretty bad. But if it's playing, that's not too bad. But it seems to me like that at this point, Sarah's opinion of Hagar certainly has not changed. She sees Hagar's child, Ishmael, the one that she sort of helped create, mocking, playing, whatever, kind of being in the way of her son. And her son was the one of promise. So now we've got this issue arising right there. Sarah becomes afraid that Ishmael is going to take Isaac's inheritance, not the money, but the descendants is what she's worried about. And she tells Abraham, she says, you got to get rid of her. This is twice now that Hagar is going to leave. The first time sort of on her own. The second time she's being sent out. Once again, she finds herself in the desert. We read this morning that they gave her a little bit of food, put some water, and that was about. She wanders aimlessly, runs out of water, and ultimately she sets Ishmael under a bush and steps away because she does not want to watch her son die. Now think about that for just a second. The first time she goes by this stream, she's by this water. She's there, in a sense, protected. But the second time, it's not really there for her. And she puts her son under this bush, sort of out of sight, out of mind, because he's going to die, and she didn't want to see that happen right there. Once again, though, chapter 21, if you're not there already. Genesis chapter 21, looking at verses 17 through 20. And God heard the voice of the lad, and then the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven and said to her, what ails you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is, this small child, this son, it's not a small child, but their son, hidden under this bush. Arise, lift up the child, and hold him with your hand, for I will make him a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And so God was with the boy, and he grew and dwelt in the wilderness. See, in this situation, once again, we see God looking after Hagar. He remains faithful to Hagar through her life, and Hagar, we can assume, remains faithful to him. Now, this story provides us with a few lessons as well. On our way over tonight, she was telling me some things, and she said, and it's something that I agree, and I suspect most of you would as well. She said that she felt like Hagar was a very sad story for Hagar because she didn't really ask for any of this, but was sort of thrust into this. And there's a lot of trouble that came along as a result of it. Well, can we relate to that? Sometimes we end up in situations that maybe we didn't even do anything wrong. Maybe we didn't ask for, and all of a sudden it becomes a big time problem for us as well. Some lessons here. Well, first of all, we can say that God sees us and God hears us and sees us. All right. He saw Hagar. How many of you, based on what we've talked about this morning and this evening, how many of you would like to reenact Hagar's life in your own life? I see no hands. Nobody here says, boy, what Hagar went through sounds like something that I would like to go through, right? That doesn't sound very appealing at all. But she had to go through it. Not everybody's life will be perfect. We can all relate to that, though. But God saw her. He saw her misery. He saw her cries for help, but he kept his promises to her. And we can assume he'd do the same for us. Second lesson here, that God provides. The first time we see Hagar out into the wilderness, the angel of the Lord in the desert shows up. She's by a spring of water, right? The second time, she's without anything. Her supplies that she's taken with her have gone away. She has nothing left. Can you imagine the one thing you would want more than anything if you were in the desert? If you know anybody who's ever been maybe in Iraq, if they were in the military or something like that, how hot it would have been. I can't relate. You can tell me, but I can't really relate. But the closest thing that I can get to is we were driving up from southern Arizona to middle of Arizona, and the car had a temperature on it that said it was like 122 degrees. Some of you, Josh, you've probably been out there. You know what that's like. Well, if you were out there for more than 5 minutes, you'd have to have gallons of water to be able to drink. She has nothing in this situation. Now, it'd be bad enough for you, but what if it was your child there with you? And not only could you not provide for yourself, you couldn't provide for that child as well. That would be the worst kind of situation. But God had made the impossible happen for Hagar. And God often does the same for us. How many of us have ever thought, well, I want something. I'd like for this to happen. I'd like for this to happen. And it doesn't happen. And it's almost like we give up on it, or we just sort of forget about it. It's like, well, that's never going to happen. And then almost as soon as we do that, then what happens? Sometimes that was, oh, wow, what a surprise. Well, that's kind of what we have right here. So instead of giving up hope, God will provide for us. The third, God will still work despite misguided. About that from the situation this morning, right? When Sarah brings Hagar into this situation, when Ishmael is ultimately born, was Sarah's heart in the right place? I think it was, if only because she knew that it had to come through Abraham that this child would be born. So I think she's trying to do the right thing. Did she do the right thing? She didn't. I think she's trying to. I genuinely think that she was trying to. Failed in what she was doing. Well, sometimes our efforts are a little misguided as well. Should she have offered Hagar to Abraham? No. Should Abraham have said yes to Hagar? No. None of that should have happened, but it did. And we can't change the fact that it did happen. God, however, worked through those situations. Hagar was blessed. Sarah and Isaac, their family was a recipient of the progress. And you would have thought then, okay, well, that's the end of the line for Hagar. I want you to turn to Genesis chapter 17. Genesis 17. And this is right before Isaac is born. He won't be born, I think, until chapter 21, maybe 18, I guess. But Genesis 17, I want us to look at verse 15 to start with. Then God said to Abraham, as for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. And I will bless her and also give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of people shall be from her. So I'm going to stop there for just a second, because this is what he is saying about Sarah. Even through all of this sort of negative, even through all of these bad decisions that have been made, even through this misguided effort, he says, through her, you'll have this child. Let's go forward, 17. Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? And shall Sarah, who is 90, bear a child? Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. And God said, no, Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his descendants after him. And as for Ishmael, because the sentence doesn't end there, as for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. He shall beget 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant is established with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this time next year. Then he finished talking with him, and God went up from Abraham. So I want us to think about that for a second. Did God just sort of kill off Hagar and Ishmael? No. Because as we said this morning, who was the father of Ishmael? Abraham. And there was a concern there that was still his son, no matter what the situation had sort of presented itself. Now, I want to think about what we read tonight from the book of Galatians. The book of Galatians, chapter 4, Paul's letter to the Galatians. Paul makes an allegory out of this Hagar-Sarah situation. God looked after Hagar, but his original plan was with Abraham and Sarah. Through their mistakes, it had changed. And Paul looks back at this. So if you want to go to Galatians chapter 4, it's exactly what Dad read there just a few moments ago, 21 through 31. But we read that Paul says to cast out the bondwoman. And I've seen this written, and you can see the same thing there in Galatians chapter 4 as well. But Hagar and Sarah represent sort of two different covenants, as it were. I want us to think about this for just a second. Hagar was a bondwoman, right? It was free. Ishmael was born of flesh, right? Ishmael didn't have to, none of that had to happen, but it did happen, right? It happened because of decisions and poor thoughts that were by Sarah there as well. On the flip side, Isaac had been born of promise, in part because they said, you're going to have this child. And Sarah and Abraham both sort of laughed at this and said, we are too old. This can't happen. But what did we say this morning? Is nothing was too big for God to take care of, right? Hagar, Paul said that sort of ends on Mount Sinai. That ends there. But Sarah would be a mother of all. We looked this morning how Sarah is both a physical mother and a spiritual mother, right? She gave birth physically to Isaac, but then through Isaac, they were descendants that all sort of traced back to her. Hagar was in bondage, but Sarah was in freedom. Hagar was the fleshly seed. Sarah was the spiritual seed. Hagar was the persecutor. She would represent that. Sarah would represent the persecuted. Hagar would not inherit, even though God looked after her, and Sarah's group would. So the point of this, I think Paul sort of makes this allegory sort of out of it. I don't necessarily know that it's a perfect record of both of them. But what Paul is saying to the people there of Galatia is he is saying that we have a choice, all right? And he's inviting them, he's asking them, he's encouraging them to follow him, as he said, to imitate him as he imitated Christ, but to become part of them, to be part of this chosen people. Well, that was not something that was available for non-Jewish people, right? The Jewish people were the chosen people, but if you were a Jew, if you weren't a Jew, you were a Gentile in that larger sense. But Paul is opening up the door for all of them. And see, that's the same thing for us, right? Nobody in here is Jewish, but all of us here have a door open, right? All of us have a door open because of this promise that was given and this promise that was then extended when he came, we read that Jesus comes to the Jew first, comma, but also to the Greek. The opportunity was there for us as well. But see, Hagar and her son Ishmael could never have that promise. That was not something for them. See, sometimes we want to sort of alter the plan of God, but we can't do that, right? We don't have any ability to, but we think we can. But remember, how big are we? In a great big world. And not only that, how many people do you think have lived on the world since Hagar and Sarah and Abraham have lived here? We're really small, right? Instead of trying to change it or manipulate it, instead of trying to say, this would be better, what should we do? We should let God handle things and assume that God has things taken care of. It's hard for us to do that, right? Because in almost every aspect of our life, we would much rather have control, right? Let me fix this. But when we fix it, we sometimes find ourselves in the same position that Isaac, Ishmael, Sarah, Hagar, even today, cause conflict. Mary said on the way over, as we were continuing this conversation, she said there's still conflict in the world because of this Isaac, Ishmael issue. It's never really stopped. Think about that. One poor decision has caused chaos and conflict for thousands of years. Let God handle it, and let's just sit back and see how it works out. I think that's the better example for us. If there's any way that we can help you, anything that we can do for you, we extend this invitation every time we invite you to come while we stand and sing.